Thank you, Madam Chair. Just before we start the public briefing today, as a reminder to committee, committee wanted to hear from landlords and developers to inform their study on housing as a human right. There were a few reminders sent out to landlords and developers recently. Mr. Warburton with Outpost agreed to brief committee as well as Borealis Developments, who committee heard from a few weeks ago, and we have yet to hear back from Northview and Midwest. Thank you.
Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to this public meeting of the Standing Committee on Social Development. My name is Jane Wayellen Armstrong and I am the MLA for Montpellier Clúcha Region and Chair of the Standing Committee on Social Development. I will now ask members in the room to introduce themselves for the record, starting from my left.
It's you. Looks like it's you. Okay. Kieran Testart, I'm the member for Range Lake.
George Nearsu, the member for the Mackenzie Delta.
Julian Morse, MLA for Frame Lake.
Shauna Morgan, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Cheryl Yakla, I'm a member for the Techo.
Thank you, members. Today we will receive a briefing on housing as a human rights from Rob Warburton with Outpost. So this briefing is part of this committee studies on how NWT legislation and policies can incorporate housing as a human right. So please note this meeting is being live streamed to the Assembly social media channel. I would like to remind all members and witnesses to direct all questions and comments to myself as chair, and to wait to be recognized before speaking to help us have a good meeting. So I will now pass it over to our presenters. Please introduce yourself.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you very much for having me here. Just a little background on kind of who I am and what I've been doing, and then get into kind of some things I want to talk to. My focus professionally has been basically repurposing existing buildings to give them new life and new spaces for businesses and residents. I've been doing this since 2014, exclusively focused on Yellowknife. In the last 3 years, solely focused on the downtown core of Yellowknife. For example, our latest project was converting a former downtown motel into 26 affordable suites. This provides space for also 2 small businesses. It's walkable. It involves Yellowknife car share. It means most residents don't need cars and can walk to work. In addition, I've been advocating for realistic and practical housing solutions for even longer than that. The massive disconnect between the reality of building, owning, and operating housing and commercial buildings and the policies and legislation that all levels of government have is where I've really focused my work. My work is currently very municipal focused. However, there are many ways the GMT can adjust policies, legislation to attract housing investment throughout the territory and address housing as a human right. Is this going to work? It's working. Can I have the next slide, please? It's not working. Thanks. So what is the housing market? I think there's some confusion often between market and non-market, so my focus today is going on mostly market housing. So as housing is privately owned by an individual or a company and does not receive subsidies in any way to purchase or maintain it. So this is a big difference between market and non-market. Market pays for itself, non-market has some level of government subsidization. Prices are set by the private market. It's very important to remember that. They are not dictated by another level of government. And about 92% of our housing in Yellowknife, for example, is provided by the market housing, so either rental or home ownership. And about 70% of every NMT resident lives in some kind of market community. They vary on how they operate. Some, like Yellowknife, operate like a quote-unquote normal market, whereas other smaller places work very similar but not quite the same. Point being is that the majority of your residents in your territory live in market housing. So understanding how that works and how to use that to have more housing in your territory is really important. Next slide, please. So financing. I put this in here because the core of market housing is financing. Very few people have all the money to build all the houses. Most people have a mortgage. So it's really important to understand how that financing works and what we can and cannot do in the territory. So lenders are very reluctant to finance speculative housing projects, so things you build without some kind of use, especially in non-traditional markets, which they consider our entire territory a non-traditional market, leading to higher financing costs and higher amounts cost for capital, which means if someone spends money here, they expect a higher return because the risk is higher. Inflation in costs for building materials makes housing projects financially challenging. There's a caricature or a conception that somehow developers are rolling around in bags of money. This is not true. They take big risks and they do make money. But there's a lot of challenges, as you heard from your presenter before on the Blanca. It's a lot in to have a lot out. So market housing requires a return on investment. It means that yes, the developer or owner will make money in the housing. Profits in the housing sector are often seen in a negative light. But if there is no return on investment, then nothing will get built. No one will rent housing. No one will sell housing. This is a belief system which really hinders us a lot of ways because folks will dismiss market housing as for-profit and greedy, but it is how you get most housing built. So capitalism is not perfect, but it does drive a lot of units in your city. I love my community, so much so that I've put my entire life savings and a few other people's into the city. This is my livelihood, but it also has to pay me an income. I have to live off it, or else I'm not going to do it. I'll just go work for you folks. Long-term commitments greatly assist in acquiring funding for projects. This can be in many forms. Traditional, obviously, leasing and contracts. I know the GMT gets pitched all the time to sign long-term leases. That is, in most part, to meet financing requirements for whoever is building you a thing or leasing you a thing or running the thing for you. This is why they need those long-term contracts. I know there's a hesitancy because you're debt ceiling to do that, or inability even. But without you signing long-term leases and contracts, it doesn't allow the financing to happen to build the housing, to build all the things you need. And yeah, your commitment is a big one. You're seen as a really great tenant or a really good user of a space, which helps those banks who are highly hesitant to actually do something. Private market has more options than government. I mean this in the financing realm. We can move quicker, we can build way more efficiently. There's a government price and there's everybody else's price when you build things. And we can provide solutions you might not consider or even know exist. The box that the government works in for financing is very limited, not very creative, but the market can do a lot more than that. So however you can activate and use the private market to help you do things, we can solve problems. I have an example from the last government, so I'm not picking on this one. The current day shelter in Yellowknife is an excellent example of kind of how the market can solve a problem for you. During COVID, there was a need for additional shelter space very quickly and acutely. The health minister at the time was told that spring, actually April 15th, by multiple folks in the private sector that a modular solution was the only practical option given the GMT's timeframes. I sat down with folks from health, they described the problem they want to solve, and I told them the same thing. The only solution to that problem is modular, and you need to order it yesterday. But, typical style, this was ignored, and in the end, when we ended up with a modular unit over across, you can see it from here, I think. And it was done at the 11th hour with not purpose-built things, and it was made to work. And then the complaint I heard afterwards was, oh, modular doesn't work, it's very expensive. For the price that was paid for those used units, if the advice would have been taken from the private sector, that could have been custom-made, shipped up, and a beautiful building could exist there right now for the same price you paid. But because it was ignored, because there was some other option people were looking at, that didn't happen. Asking the private sector for solutions only works if you empower your staff and you actually action it. If you ask for solutions and problems to be solved and then wait forever to make a decision, those options go away. The GMT is not special, and there's often no magical or cheaper solution that the GMT finds that the private sector has already done before, tried before, lost money on before. So there's no magic bullet, and it seems that when these projects come up, there's all this dithering to try to wait to find a cheaper option. You're not going to find it. So we are really good at what we do as a sector. So if you ask our advice to do something, especially on the housing space, and you don't follow some of that advice, you'll pay more. And you see it time and time again whenever these projects then eventually go to tender. Next slide, please. So I think housing is a human right. What folks are getting at is we need more of it. We need to have housing for everyone. And I think it's important why the market matters, because I know the government focuses a lot on social housing, but the better, if you're more efficient and better at engaging the housing market, or market housing, sorry, it will actually affect public housing in the end. So you need to build more housing in the entire housing continuum. So all the way from the shiny new stuff, all the way to what you have kind of affordable entry-level housing. And you increase this, in my opinion, increased supply of market housing creates affordability through vacancy chains. So what a vacancy chain is the affordable units you have today. If you look at their age, they're all going to be 20, 30 years old in our city. To get old, you need to be built in the first place. So the only way you have older affordable units is to have newer, more supply coming online. So, because a building can't get old if it's never built. So you need more supply. And when you add units at the top of the market, those folks that have the means, have the income, can rent those expensive units, but then they free up units that they came out of. And then the person that can afford a little less, it goes down this chain of vacancy to the point where you're actually creating vacancy in units right above public housing. Those affordable units, those entry-level units, they start opening up. And then folks can start moving out of public housing when they're ready into those market units. But if there's no movement, if no one is moving in that line of, if there's no units built, and not just Yellowknife in any community, there's nowhere for people to go. So then what you have is the Vancouvers of the world, where people with a high ability to pay then start bidding up all the old housing because they can pay more. So you need a larger supply of housing to move things along so people can actually enter that market. The problem you hear about a lot right now is I can't afford to leave public housing, or I can't afford to move because I can't afford the next unit. That's because there's not enough vacancy. There's not enough stuff available so people have somewhere to go. So that's how I think it affects public housing. There's a gentleman out of Vancouver who I follow quite a bit. His name is Ute Lee. He has an About Here, is kind of an advocacy group. And I'm just going to quote the vacancy chain stuff. Preventing new housing from being built doesn't get rid of the demand for housing. It just shifts that pressure onto older housing in the housing market. When we continue to build new housing supply, the people who are willing and able to pay more for the housing tend to move into newer houses and up and up and up. When we don't build new housing, we just put pressure on the overall housing market, and the people who can pay more for their housing just bid up the cost. You had a presenter here before that was talking about how many non-market communities, the only option is public housing or homelessness. And I have some policy recommendations on how to kind of encourage some market into maybe non-market communities, or the market communities you have that aren't functioning really well to have more market stuff in there. If you don't have any more options, folks will be stuck where they are. So I think it's really important to make sure you have those other options. Next slide, please. So policy and process recommendations. Folks, I don't know if this is the correct name, but you're working on a building act. This is probably one of the most, in the construction space, one of the biggest opportunities you're going to have to really drive housing or really kill it. So we don't have a building act in the territory, as you know. We're the only place, I think, in the country that doesn't have one. The reason this can drive housing is you're going to create certainty. So anyone's going to build a house in a non-market community or outside of so only follows the National Building Code, but not the rest of the territory does. The certainty will be really good for developers and builders, even the contract public housing, because there's certainty. They know exactly what we want. We're talking about the same thing. When there's uncertainty, then people price in that risk. So this is why non-market communities, in my opinion, get much higher bids for housing builds, because there's so much uncertainty on what that's going to look like. Title land in all communities to facilitate market housing. This is a big problem in the city of Yellowknife, as you know. The city wants all land in their boundary. Titled land is the only way, or maybe even long-term leases, is the only way you're going to get any kind of market housing in communities that don't have market housing right now. The big five banks have rules and regulations, and I know some other folks have an opinion, well, we should educate the banks. So they don't care about us. They have a policy, and that is it. They're not changing for the Northwest Territories. So you need to be aware of what their rules and processes are, and you need to adapt to meet them if you want to have a market solution in a community. This generally means long-term tenure on land, so titled land or a lease, long-term lease. Banks not loaning money if those two things don't exist. So anytime we're talking about land transfer in communities or any kind of way of empowering communities, this needs to be part of that conversation. Or else there's no way for anybody except for the territorial government or the feds to solve that housing problem. And you just don't have deep enough pockets to solve that on your own. You need to empower the private sector to help you here. Adjust policies and legislation to match other jurisdictions and attract investment. Same idea is what are other places doing that allows them to have housing markets and maybe non-traditional housing marketplaces. Yukon has some good examples in remote communities, so is Nunavut. Well, Nunavut and Iqaluit has some unique solutions there. They meet the metrics of the banking world, so then you can get a mortgage and do a house. And really leverage the private sector and open up the creative solutions. The private sector doesn't have a debt cap. There's no lack of capital in the private market to build housing units. There's a lack of attraction. So the North does a very poor job. Yellowknife is where I focus, but a very poor job in attracting that. There's a lot of money to go into the housing space, and we don't currently do really anything to attract that. So it's all land tenure and those kind of issues, but anything you can do to kind of modernize and get out of the way. Going back to the Building Act, I'll give you one specific example. A lot of places are going to single stairwell exits for like a multifamily, like apartment building, versus 2 stairs. That sounds super weedy and boring, but stuff like that frees up like 30% of the floor space. You get more living units. It's easier to build. So when you folks are doing things like that, I really encourage you to reach out to the private sector and see how the legislation and the policy you're writing will or will not work in the real world. So that's a lot very fast, but happy to take any questions.
Thank you for the presentation. So members, does anybody have any questions? Oh, okay.
Oh, Madam Chair, I just want to officially say I'm on the record. I'm here.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Yes, Mr. Hawkins has joined us. So does anybody? Okay, and Ms. Morgan?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Warburton, for coming and speaking with us today. I think it provides a good perspective that we haven't spent much time thinking about or talking about, so it helps to make the puzzle fit together better. I wondered if you could explain in more detail. You said for non-market communities, there are options other than public housing and homelessness. Can you give us some sense of what role for private housing developers there might be in non-market communities? Just give us any examples or explain a bit more.
Yes, Mr. Warburton?
Thank you. So this is a tricky one. I think in those non-market communities, the main developer would likely be the DevCorps or whatever Indigenous government is in those communities, because they're motivated by other things besides just a return on investment. But they still need the same metrics as a someone building in Yellowknife, they still need to tick all the boxes for banking and financing. So those rules don't change if it's a local or kind of out-of-town developer. So things like I mentioned, like titled land, long-term leases, making sure the land tenure and all the parts are there to tick the boxes for financing. Indigenous governments and development corporations don't need to always go to the territorial government, the feds. There is a whole market out there they could access. In fact, I think they have access to much cheaper capital than anybody would here, but they still need to tick all those boxes for financing. So they kind of have to have the same parameters set up and in place to allow that for market housing to be built. Yeah.
Ms. Morgan, do you have a follow-up question?
I also wondered, you mentioned Iqaluit, and maybe there's some others you have in mind, but have been working to come up with some unique solutions. I know that their Nunavut 3000 explicitly references partnerships with private developers, just including everyone to get this problem solved in a quicker way. Do you have any insights into what they're doing that you think could transfer to the NWT?
Mr. Warburton?
My answer will essentially be what you said there. They are engaging very actively with the private market. They're aware that there's no way they're hitting those 3,000 units without private investment. It's just not going to be possible. So they're trying to figure out ways on how to attract that and kind of wrap it into their plan. And they are doing some interesting things around long-term leasing in some communities. Leasing, I mean like land leasing. So a long enough land lease can tick a box for a bank. You've heard of 99-year leases. Basically, as far as the bank's concerned, the loan's paid off before that. So they are working in that space quite a bit. But it's really how they're partnering with industry is what's really unique over there, I think. And not just with the financial side, also on the building side. So they're doing some really interesting things on tenders. They're not pretending it's competitive bid anymore. They're just putting numbers out, saying this is the number for the tender, who can do it, and they do the contracting based on kind of how good the contractor is, because the prices they're getting back were insane per unit. So they're realizing their process needs some shifting, and they're doing that. And I haven't seen that here yet. We're still tendering things that get built for GNWT that are in Housing Corps that are exponentially more expensive than what private sector would build it for. Your numbers are not our numbers, because we don't have to go to competitive bid process. We don't have to hire as many checks and balances as you do. We can do what's most efficient to build. You also saw us with Indigenous governments too when we had the rapid housing money go in. That housing was way faster and way more efficient than the territorial government could ever build it. When the money was given to the community to actually solve the problem, they did it really fast and way more affordable.
Thank you. Thank you. If we have more time, we can ask, we have more time, we will do second sets of questions. So, Mr. Tistart?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, and thank you for being here, Mr. Warburton. I would point out that we are not the government, because you made some references to our projects and our policies, and we oversee the government, but we are here for the people, not for the government itself, not for the GNWT. Now, that being said, we still have to play our part in influencing policy outcomes, and housing is top of mind. So my previous role before this, I worked for a First Nation, and we had a heck of a time recruiting folks from the South who had the skill sets we needed, or even from Yellowknife, but the few that did apply were from the South, and we had to turn a lot, or they ultimately withdrew because they couldn't find affordable housing. Now, thankfully, you actually provided affordable housing for one of those employees, who I think is still with you. How did you do it? I think the old Northern Lights, which didn't have the best reputation in this community, especially downtown, reforming that into something that is a home to people and a positive contribution to the community is pretty commendable. So how are you able to do that and stabilize the price, both in renovating it into those units and in stabilizing rents? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Warburton?
Thank you, and thank you. That's it was a labor of love for sure. But professionally, what I focus on is repurposing buildings, and mostly because I find that is kind can be done at a much more efficient price point than a new build. You're not creating it from scratch. You're taking something that exists and you're modifying it. So there's a lot of efficiency in there doing that. And then I self-managed it. I couldn't afford a general contractor because that made it really unaffordable. It didn't pencil out that way. So I ended up doing what you see many developers in Yellowknife do. They do everything themselves. So they're the developer, which is usually the financing part. They're the general contractor, organizing the build, and then the leasing agent at the end. So most other places down south, there'll be different companies do all those things. Up here, you need to be a jack of all trades to get that efficiency to do that. The other large reason I was able to get those rents affordable was I went through, CMHC has an affordable housing program called MI Select, which essentially allows you to borrow more money. I'm surmising, but that's what it is. You can borrow more money at lower rates. So that allowed me to bring the rents down to a level which CMHC considers affordable. There's a bit of a problem with that word affordable because it's really affordable for who. But when I say affordable, I'm referring specifically to CMHC's metrics on affordability. So yeah, it's still tough. There's not a lot of wiggle room on that one, but the financing packages the feds had in place, and then be able to do using existing structure was how I did that. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Tester, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you for that. And I think that's a great project and a good example of where developers can help solve this problem and aren't in it for the money, so to speak, but they still need that helping hand. So do you know, a two-part question, is that fund available to Housing Corporation or government agencies, or is it solely for developers and co-investment? And the other point to that is, would it be helpful for the GNWT to develop similar funding streams? Which I'm assuming the answer is yes, but like, do you have a program you could see that fitting into that's offered by the territorial government currently? And can you give us some ideas of what that might look like locally? Because obviously it'd be smaller scale, but it might be more fine-tuned to the North's needs. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes, thank you. Mr. Warburton?
Thank you. So the MI Select program is not a grant. It's not, there's no, taxpayers don't pick up any money. It's insurance, just like you're buying a first-time home buyer's insurance. Now that process is broken. It took 9 months end to end to get a one-page approval. That's a different conversation with the feds. If you're ever lobbying them, you should tell them that you should hurry up on their insurance approvals. But I paid a very large fee for them to insure that mortgage. And that mortgage now goes through like a Big Five bank. So it's an insurance product, which makes the risk lower for the bank, and then they'll loan more money. I don't know why the Housing Corporation or the Indigenous government wouldn't be able to access the same program. It's just a loan guarantee, is essentially what it is. You pay a hefty fee to do it. There's all kinds of very unique and interesting programs out there for financing stuff. There's a whole set of loans out there called non-recourse financing, which means debt that does not go on your books, i.e. your debt ceiling. And I've never heard these conversations through Housing Corporation or territorial government. They may have had them. I don't know the back end there, but there's ways around problems if we know what the problem is. And the answer of, well, we had a debt ceiling, we can't sign more leases or loan more money, that's a bit simple. If I didn't do anything every time I ran out of a loan limit, or I'd be out of business. So you got to figure it out. And a little more creativity and a little more engagement in kind of market financing, I think, would help the GNWT a lot. GNWT-wise, I don't know what your ability is to do loan guarantees, but you're, again, putting your weight behind something de-risks something. So if an Indigenous government or development corps wants to do something, traditionally they'll ask you for a long-term lease, but is there any kind of financial guarantee mechanisms that you can build in or you can do that de-risk that so they can go to a bank and get loans or better terms to make it work? You swing a big financial stick, and the answer doesn't always need to be cash. It can also be the weight of your organization.
Thank you. Ms. Yekelai, do you have a question? Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Warburton, for your presentation. My question is, have you worked with many Indigenous governments in the North? Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Warburton?
Thanks. I've only ever worked exclusively in Yellowknife, very specific. I have had very brief discussions with YKDFM before. The issue I found, it's large corporations in general, not just Indigenous development course, their decision-making process is just too slow. When it comes to housing and real estate in particular, it's not fast, and then it gets very fast, really quick. As soon as you start doing something, things start happening in quick succession. And larger corporations tend to have a challenge to respond quick enough, especially because it's all opportunity when things come up, and leases or land or whatever the issue is with real estate. There's not a lot of time to assess and kind of look into it all. So I haven't done anything yet, but I do hope that they eventually get to a spot where they're comfortable making quicker decisions, and then I think there'll be a lot more engagement from the private sector with Indigenous governments.
Okay, Ms. Yakla, do you have a follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Warburton, for that answer. You mentioned, I have a little bit of trouble understanding the vacancy chain. I'm trying to organize that, and can you explain that a little bit better? Thank you.
Mr. Warburton?
Thank you. I actually had a little video which I didn't put in my slide deck, and I should have, because about 30 seconds it explains it really well. It basically means that if you add more units at the top of the market, which every new housing unit built, if it has no government subsidy, will be the most expensive thing in your market, because it's modern labor costs, modern material costs, modern land costs. So it's going to be, just by design, the most expensive thing to rent in your town or buy in your town will be the new thing. But by adding more units at the top, people that are in units now that can afford move into those units. People below them, income-wise, move up to those units. And there's this kind of chain effect of people sliding up into units, all the way down to affordable units at the bottom or above public housing. But if you don't build more units, it's a supply problem. If you don't build more units, then there's nowhere, people can't go anywhere. They can't move. And then the people that have higher incomes just bid up everything. So then you see, this is where you see older apartments go for more money because there's not enough supply at the top. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Ms. Yakla, do you answer that question? Okay, thank you.
Also, that kind of helps communities. Yeah, I can see it almost forces or helps a community grow, which makes so much sense. I can understand that now. Thank you, Mr. Warburton.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Mr. Nirsu, do you have a question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your presentation. Within the three communities of the Mackenzie Delta riding, there's very limited market housing available. The private sector is probably more reluctant to come build within our communities, but the need is there for especially the teachers. To attract more teachers, you need more housing, public housing, market housing available. Just recently, the GTC announced, and they're starting to build units within Inuvik, Aklavik, and Fort McPherson, and next year they'll be building units in Tsigichik. But those units are for the beneficiaries who can afford them, who can afford a mortgage. And they're doing it at a somewhat reduced rate to help the beneficiaries become homeowners. But I think one of the setbacks in having someone go into market housing and realize what they have to pay in the end, like all their utilities and rent, and it becomes too high. And I believe maybe it's one of the reasons the private sector hasn't stepped up and come into our communities. Would you have any recommendations how to attract the private sector into building these units? Because right now the GTC is building it, but it's for beneficiaries, but the teachers, in order to attract teachers and resource people within our communities, we need more market housing available. Would you have any recommendations on how to attract the private sector into our smaller communities? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Warburton?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. It's going to sound a little bit redundant, but it's really about figuring out what would be required financially for someone to come in there. So I talked about land leasing. I talked about land tenure. I'm not sure. I know Inuvik has titled land, but outside of Inuvik, it is what do you need to do to tick the box for the financing and do those things. I think having the local government, Indigenous government do that or their economic development arm is really good because there's motivations there besides just profit, right? There's a motivation to help folks in a different way. But if they structure it right, they can still access the same financing programs as the market does. So there's a bit of an opportunity, I think, there to kind of grow our bandwidth, Indigenous governments and DevCores in small communities where maybe there's not a big enough market to attract someone that would have a purely for-profit motive. But there's some kind of hybrid or mixing there. But yeah, it really is trying to figure out and understand what a bank or a lender would need in those communities to feel comfortable owing that money. That's the first thing I would do before trying to figure out policy changes or anything else. What does the bank need? And then trying to figure out how to provide that certainty for financing, and then have those Indigenous governments or DevCores start accessing that capital.
Thank you. Mr. Nurse, do you have a follow-up question?
No, I'm good. I just had that one. Thank you.
Thank you. I do have a question too as well regarding the market rental. I know in the small communities we don't have too many, just like Mr. Nersu said. And that with the local housing, I know we have we have a long wait list. So with the market rental in Yellowknife, what's a wait list like here? Thank you. Because I've been hearing from a lot of people that they've been on the wait list for like a year or two, and it's really difficult to get into a unit. So social housing would be even more difficult, or some of them might not qualify. So I just want to know what's the wait list like here with the market rental. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, so it is easing, noticeably less pressure than even the spring this year, but that's because we had a lot of market rentals built. So we had one developer alone did 250 units that are going to be online by the spring this year. Noticeably, one developer has built more housing units than the Housing Corps has in a decade. That's not lost on me, and it should be an indicator that how fast and how much the market can provide if given the right metrics. Yellowknife swings very quickly. So by the time those units come online, the Blanca, which you heard from the other day, and a number of other builds, the Housing Corporation's building 50 doors downtown. They're converting the Aspen apartments. So that will quickly move our vacancy rate, I feel, in the next year or two, which is good. I should have a 3 to 5% vacancy rate at any time. That's a healthy balance between enough demand to still drive some new units in the market, but also not high enough to dissuade people from building anything. It also keeps rents in check. When you have a low vacancy rate, that's where you see escalations of rental rates. Because of the exact thing I talked about, people that can afford it bid up older stuff. Whereas if you have a healthy vacancy rate, there's an incentive for people to be competitive on their lease rates and not bring them up quickly. So yeah, I think there is a pent-up demand in Yellowknife, but I do feel that is easing right now and will ease up as more of these buildings come online. We got a lot of units coming online in the next 4, 5, 6 months, a couple hundred, so that's going to make a big difference for us. And we are also we're not a normal market here. We're heavily weighted towards corporate landlords. Most concentrated rental market for corporate landlords in the country is Yellowknife. So there's a lot of room for local ownership and kind of local operations, because what we see practically is as more units are built that are locally owned or are owned by smaller kind of non-publicly traded people, in the end, the folks that are vacant are the large corporate landlords. And then when they're vacant, they fix it up. So they're not evil and nefarious. They are just parts of capitalism which don't love a lot of, and they're motivated by vacancy. So the more vacancy we have, actually, the better the condition of the units will get.
And same thing like what Mr. Tistart said about the Northern Lights. Is that Well, I'm glad you did that. So what's the vacancy rate like over there at the moment? Thank you.
I think due to location and the price, it's full and I have a wait list. So it is, it's interesting. So CMHC puts out rental market data every year, which I can tell you from my experience is egregiously incorrect. It does not reflect the actual market in any way. Their average rents are way too low. Their vacancy rate's totally off. They're so far behind the curve when it comes to data. Unfortunately, that's what everything's based off of, from banks to CMHC insurance to, it's all based off those numbers. So yeah, it's, I'm full, but, and I know the vacancy rate going up, folks have asked, like, are we overbuilding? I don't think we are. Because I noticed in the past when we've had high vacancy rates, again, it's not local landlords that are empty, it's large corporate landlords that are empty. And that's okay, they can afford that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Morris. And then we'll go to Mr. Hopkins. Mr. Morris?
Thank you. Yeah, just coming back to the end of your presentation there, you know, you suggested changes in policy and legislation. You mentioned the example of changing the amount of stairwells in buildings. Land availability, I think, is one that we've talked about quite a bit. I'm familiar with that issue. So I'm curious, like, what are some other ideas? Did you have kind of some other ideas in mind in terms of policy and legislation changes that are needed that the Assembly hasn't currently looked at or maybe hasn't had brought to them? I'm curious to hear some more specifics. Thanks.
Okay, Mr. Warburton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, go with those 2 points first. So Building Act, it's going to be super dry and super tactical when it does come, the first drafts to the Assembly, but I think getting the input on those from especially construction side and developers, like a single stairwell is being done everywhere, for example, and it increases the usability of a building, makes it cheaper to build. I think we're getting a lot of pushback is that is a change, that assumes more risk in many ways. I know in general governments are adverse to risk. So I know at one point the fire marshal office here wanted to sprinkler single-family homes. That was what was the idea in the hopper years and years ago. Thank goodness that never happened. I can't imagine sprinkling a home in Tuktoyaktuk, how much that would cost. So making sure that when this stuff comes, like the Building Act, that we don't treat it as these silo things, and we make sure we get input, especially from people that need to build it and pay for it, because there's absolutely the safest thing you can build. You can make that in your Building Act so it's super safe, and then no one ever builds it or has a hard time building it because it's too expensive and not attached to reality. So making sure in those that come to you that you test those against people that actually do the thing you're trying to regulate. Land availability, you've beat this horse to death. We have a whole bunch of times. With no land, there's no housing. So in market communities, that involves getting the land to the community. In non-market communities, that, like I said, is figuring out some kind of tenure on that land so you can do something with it. But I guess what can we do is like not, I'll pick on the fire marshal's office. There's now an appeal process coming for that fire marshal's office, which is a long time coming. There's going to be a committee, so if you don't like what you get in an order from the fire marshal, when you're building a new building, you can go to a committee and appeal it. That sounds like a really minor change, but I would hate to know the number of things that didn't get built in this territory because they died a slow death at the permitting office. And when they got built, there's tens of millions of dollars in extra expense that got tacked on for good, valid reasons through that office. But again, making decisions in a silo where they're saying we want all these things for life safety. Well, is there other options that are maybe more fiscally prudent? So just making sure every part that touches housing, from Housing Corporation to the Fire Marshal's Office to your Building Act, your boiler inspectors, like they all have a very large financial impact when they make decisions on things. So making sure they're all aligned on the idea that we want to make it safe, but have some fiscal valuation in what you're doing. It's not cheap to send an entire mechanical system back because it doesn't have a sticker on it that the boiler inspector wants. It'd be nice if there's some modern ways this is looked at. So thinking of more of a whole government approach when you touch all these policies and processes.
Thank you. Mr. Morris, do you have a follow-up question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. The next one I wanted to ask you to kind of elaborate on a little bit more is the idea of leveraging the private sector, kind of maintaining openness to creative solutions. Again, I would just ask, like, do you have some kind of tangible examples you can give us of what you're speaking to, and maybe give an example of what's not happening now and what you think should be happening and how we might go about doing that?
Mr. Warburton?
Thanks. So what's not happening right now is the GMT doesn't have any incentives at all, as far as I know, for the private sector. There's no tax incentives. There's no, like, the city of Yellowknife has bigger incentives than the entire territorial government when it comes to building market housing. So there's really no incentive to drive housing from a territorial perspective. I know could be incorrect. I've never seen one. So that's what you're not doing. You could be doing incentives. And again, it doesn't always need to be a check. It needs to be, what is the pinch point or the pain points for folks building housing in your communities, and how can you assist that? Like I said, the loan guarantee option would be interesting to explore. Yeah, making sure that you're listening to those feedback loops and what you can do for them. What was the second part of your question? Sorry, can you say it again?
Mr. Morris?
Thanks. No, so incentives is one thing. The other one was you mentioned that there are creative solutions, be open to creative solutions. So I was just looking, do you have some examples of kind of what you're speaking to?
Mr. Warburton?
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks for the clarity. I already used one example of the day shelter. There's right now, I know we're all talking about transitional housing and how to do that. There's some creative solutions around that, around modular housing, around camps. There's all kinds of ways to solve a problem. I guess the important part to be creative with the government is it's a control problem. Often you need to kind of, if you have a budget for something and you want a problem solved, there has to be a bit of room to let off the control part and actually let the market solve something for you. If you need it fast and quick, or you need or you don't have the capacity to do it, you can then also say, I want a market solution. I want someone to solve my problem, but I'm going to be very pedantic. I'm going to predict and push and pull and tell them what they can and cannot do. So either you want the market to solve your problem or you don't. So like I said, with the day shelter, that was a good example of not taking advice when they were asking for it, and then landing on it later. So if you do want to engage the market, you really do got to lean into the fact that as a government, you may not know all the solutions, but you need to kind of let go of that level of control you have when it's public sector, because that really kills that creative solution. So, and then and be open. Like, everything's not a tender. Sometimes people have great ideas for doing things, and so they pitch the GWT. And often the answer is, well, we'll come back to when we do an RFP. That's not how that works. In the real world, that's not how anything works when you're building housing or building anything. It's opportunity, and you got to decide yes or no. So I don't know if that's a policy change or a procurement change, but when someone comes to you and says, I want to build you a downtown Aurora campus, that the answer should be yes. How can I dig into that with you? Not, no, hold off. We're going to wait to an RFP process. That's not how the reality works. And again, this is where the government needs to adjust to how the market works. The market doesn't need to adjust to you. When an opportunity comes up, and you need some process or ability within the territorial government to decide and move quickly when opportunities come up, because they do quite often. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Hawkins, you have a question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just double checking before I proceed. Can everyone hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Fantastic. Okay. So, Mr. Warburton, first of all, as always, thank you for your frankness. It's very refreshing, and I'm grateful for your time. Just quickly here, I'll just say it's interesting. You describe problems that the government creates, but, it's in this weird position, whereas an industry would take off and say, hey, we'll solve this problem, whereas in government will say, the safest way to do this, or the best way to do this, or the platinum service to do this, always ends up creating this enormous bureaucracy to answer sometimes the simplest questions. And I want to acknowledge and thank you for pointing out that the big banks aren't interested in bending to the GNWT. I frankly get so exhausted hearing people say we need to educate the banks. I think it's the reverse. We need to educate ourselves to cater our responses to the banks. And the last thing I'll say just before I get into my question is, one particular bank has 14 million customers. I just looked it up while we were speaking, lending trillions of dollars a year, and I'm referring to one bank. I don't think they have time to listen to our story. So I guess really now I get to the questions. So you did point out one interesting thing, and do you see, for example, the GNWT could create, for example, a loan assurance program for private developers such as yourself? Because I've often said it's access to land and opportunity has created the wall, or the lack of opportunity for developers similar to yourself to doing these things. And would something like that, in other words, I hate to say loan guarantee, but for lack of better descriptions, could that make the very difference for someone like you to jump on board in an accelerated way to make investments, to turn old buildings into new, or even start non-existent buildings to new opportunities? Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Warburton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks, great question. I did touch on it briefly. I'm hesitant to recommend a loan assurance program, mostly because I'd be concerned that, again, the speed wouldn't be fast enough. If there was an ability for the GMT to add value to loan assurance, and if the banking and financial world saw value in that, that'd be my first question. They may not see the GMT as a big enough entity to have any weight behind their loan programs. But I think that'd be something that definitely I'd want to explore with them and see what, if that would help, what would that look like? So not us designing something, not us, it's again, engaging with big financial institutions and asking what they would want to see, and then from there decide if the territorial government could provide that assurance, as opposed to the other way around, which we usually do is we come up with a great plan and then it doesn't work in reality. So engaging the banks would be something. I say banks in a loose term. There's big five banks, but there's also all other kinds of investment kind of companies and products out there. So learning about that world would be, I think, very helpful into deciding if there was any value behind doing a program like that.
Thank you. Mr. Hawkins, do you have a follow-up question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it was asked earlier about what policy change, so I won't ask that question. However, if something else comes to mind when I ask my second question, feel free to say backfill a little bit. One of the challenges that I see, and I think I even heard in your process and presentation, is the fact that permitting process takes too long. And you're in the unlikely situation, whereas, and you also, although you're not here today wearing your city councilor hat, but let us be honest, you can never really take it off. One of the opportunities I see, and I'm curious from a professional point of view that you are here for today, is that what if the GNWT created a automatic approval process whereby, as in someone said, I'm going to build a house, as an example, or a building, it doesn't matter what it is, but we'll just say it's an approved building process under a local municipal bylaw or governance situation, but it's signed off by professionals. So rather than competing for approval that can take anywhere, from 2 weeks to 6 months or even longer, it automatically becomes approved if professionals sign it off. So in other words, the architect signs it off. It's been truly built to the NBC and meets the local building codes. The mechanical engineer, as appropriate, or electrical engineer signs them off. It has met the obligations as noted before. Could you see any value in that? I'm not going to describe it at length. I think you probably understand what I'm getting at. So, and as I mentioned, if you had any policy suggestions, now that you've had more time to think about it, I'd love to hear them. Cheers.
Thank you. Mr. Warburton?
Yeah, great question. So the GMT currently has has purview over mechanical inspections, electrical inspections, and fire inspections. I've dealt with all three, and I got to say, super professional folks to deal with. I'm at a loss as to why, if I have a professional electrical engineer, a professional mechanical engineer, or a professional fire suppression engineer, that's the wrong term for that one, with a stamp drawing, why then it goes through this convoluted process of approval by the GNBT? Somebody else has taken the risk by putting their stamp on that document. So I am, and this is an answer that eludes me and most folks in this industry, why is there this large review process, especially with the fire drawings? I don't understand what the risk mitigation is there, because they're getting a document that in theory has been risk mitigated because someone else has taken it. I have not built in our jurisdictions, but I do have folks I know professionally that build in our jurisdictions, and if they put in a stamp drawing with a fire suppression system, it's just an administrative process, because that risk has already been mitigated by that professional. That'd be a question I'd want to ask. And if you can find out, that'd be great, because I have yet to figure out why that is a hard process to do for us when other jurisdictions seem to do this very quickly. And yeah, you're right, I can't take off that city hat. The Housing Accelerator Fund has been amazing in TBD on how well that hits next year or so for permitting.
Madam Chair, can I just say I'm going to take on that challenge, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Now we have time for second sets of questions. So, Ms. Morgan.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to, again, follow up. You'd made some quick comments about successes in the Rapid Housing Initiative. And I know that was initiated by the feds and done in partnership with the city. But can you give us some idea of what was so successful about that, what elements of it, and what you think could be replicated or the GNBT could learn from that? Thanks.
Mr. Warburton?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, amazing program. So two things. One was speed and control. So that money went directly to communities. In Yellowknife, that was a committee of people who actually work in that space with a lot of different local representatives. I was on that committee before I was on council as a landlord and developer rep. And it was 2 meetings, 6 hours, and we deployed millions of dollars. And you could do capital. So a couple nonprofits bought actual housing units. It's just the speed of which it could go was really refreshing. But that requires you to trust the people in that community that they know what they need and allow them to spend that money instead of telling them or controlling this very pedantic ways that we do with funding all the time. And that impact was measurable. There's 2 nonprofits that have buildings now that didn't have buildings and are housing people. Now, are some of those buildings up to what you would consider, modern, beautiful new standard? No, but they're solving a problem. So just empowering folks to solve their problems locally. It was particularly unhelpful to hear in the last government that the recommendation was that future rapid housing money comes through GMT. I think that's a complete and utter waste of time. Just more bureaucracy. It wasn't broken. It works really well. So you just deployed a couple $100,000 to street outreach. We got a report a couple weeks later, and a couple weeks after we got that report, we had rapid housing money, which we deployed straight to it. The speed of which it can move, I think, should be a template on how government should operate. But again, it requires you to kind of let go of that control component. There's still due diligence. There's still reporting requirements, and all stuff happened. It wasn't like it was just give the money, it goes away. But really empowering people to solve their own problems instead of describing to them what they need. Fort Province got some rapid housing money, and the speed those units went in there was light years faster than Housing Corporation could put units in. Not because of anything nefarious, it's just because they can move quicker, because they can get together, make a decision, and do a thing without having to go through layers and layers of tendering and bureaucracy and all those things. So rapid housing should be a template for you on how to, I would love to see funds deployed to communities when it comes to housing. People know what they need. They don't need to write a 50,000-page tender to then get your money to build a house. You need a house. So just trust them to solve that problem. Yeah.
Okay. Ms. Morgan, do you have a follow-up?
Just a quick one, thanks. Can you clarify, you mentioned quickly, I'm not clear about this, that in the future, any rapid housing money is going to have to be channeled through the GNBT, or the GNBT said that that's how they would want it to be? Or can you just clarify where we're at with that?
Mr. Warburton?
Thank you, Chair. Yes. that is not what's happening, just to be clear. That was a comment made by the last premier that was here, that all rapid housing, and that was, to be fair, it was a comment that all the premiers made across the country, and rapid housing came out. They didn't like the idea of the feds directly sourcing money to communities. And thankfully, it appears that we've stepped away from that approach, which I think is good. Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. Morris, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. I just want to continue on the thread I was on previously. So, you know, on the idea of kind of when folks come to GNWT with a creative solution and just pitch it to them, we just got to do it. I just want to kind of work through that idea a little bit, because I know what, you know, I'm trying to kind of, if we think through this idea, I mean, if the government did start taking sole source opportunities, of course, we're going to have a lot of contractors breaking down our doors, asking why we didn't give them a chance to bid on it. And, you know, there's other things to consider. Like, let's say the project goes over budget or it fails in some way. It's GNWT that ends up looking bad because they sole sourced it, right? So how do we kind of deal with that issue of, like, you know, GNWT ends up in the difficult position of sometimes the reason the difficult processes are created is because people are looking for fairness. People are looking for accountability, all of those things. So these processes do get put in place for a reason, whether they're efficient or not. So I wonder if you could kind of comment on sort of the realities that the government faces in that regard, and, you know, how do we kind of create more nimble processes without putting ourselves in situations where we're sole sourcing contracts inappropriately? Like, do you see ways that we can kind of be nimble and still, you know, satisfy that public scrutiny that the government's under, that, you know, private corporations, of course, are not, and that's the difference there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Morris. Mr. Warburton?
Thank you. Great question. So 2 parts there. So GMT does have a policy around unsolicited bids. So they can consider an unsolicited bid. There's a process there, the exact bits of which I've never done one, so how they work. But basically, someone pitches them something, and there's a process. They can go, is that a good value? Is there a good market for that? Sorry, is that a good, like, it's not overpriced, it's a good value proposition. But they do have a process to take unsolicited bids. So when an opportunity comes up, they can take them. Now, is that used all the time? I think it's underused, but it speaks more to the opportunity of something's happening, and there's an opportunity for the government to join that process or participate in that process. So yeah, there is a process in your procurement that allows you to do that. How it works, that's I'm unaware of. Example I think of with the housing corporation is years ago looking at a tender in a community, and it's saying, I want this siding with this color, with, like, it's very prescriptive. And the more granular in detail you get when you say tender a housing corporation unit, the more it's going to cost you, and the less and less flexibility you build in, as opposed to, I'm very small, but when I want a problem solved, I meet with contractors, or I write it up, the problem I want to solve, and then I get feedback about how to do that. Oftentimes there's solutions I hadn't even thought of, because the person that's good at the thing knows things I don't. So when you get very prescriptive in tenders, like some of these tenders are very, very specific, like some tenders even require a certain type of product, which may mean you get one bid from one contractor, right? So you talk about fairness, when you get specific, so specific that there's only one dealer for the product in the territory, it makes it really hard to make it competitive. So the broader in scope that those tenders can be and would be beneficial, because then you're leaving that space for someone to solve a problem in a creative way you haven't thought about. You know, I want a house with this many square footage, this much space, you know, just describe what you want. And then take those, it's more work, I get it, on the tender side, because you're not comparing an apple to an apple. You might get a whole tray full of different kind of things. So it's more work on the tendering side, but you might actually get solutions you haven't thought about. It's the whole reason we have Troudistic foundations here, is because someone took a risk and tried something, and now that's a great foundation type for ground that moves. But that wouldn't have existed if someone hadn't kind of opened that up to some creative ideas. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I do have a question too as well, with the policy and process recommendations. Okay, you know that in small communities, we don't have a housing market, okay? And with high unemployment rate, and we don't so that makes it hard for any investors to come to our communities or to our regions, so I don't see anybody rushing to help, with a housing crisis in small communities. So I know all the stuff that you're talking about, it's mostly for larger regional center, but not for small communities. And but anyways, I'm going to ask this, because one of the things that you said in here is a building act can drive or hinder new housing. So what can the small communities, like that we represent, should do to help ease and build more housing for people, and yeah, so because I don't see any investor, rushing to help us to come into our communities. So I just want to hear from you on that. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Great question. I'll speak to the market small communities. I think this is why it's really important in the market communities, which is 7% of your population. The market communities have the highest core housing need in the territory. The more you can engage and drive market to solve problems in market communities, it'll take a pressure off the housing corporation for them places that maybe there is no market. They'll have more bandwidth to spend time and money and resources in those communities because now they're not focusing on places like Yellowknife, where there is an active market that could be engaged to solve more of those problems. So yeah, I think even though it may not be the small communities, I think there is an impact because Housing Corps has only so many things it can do. And so the more the market takes off their plate in, say, Yellowknife, the more they can do elsewhere. So I think it does matter. The Building Act, I think we have a really unique opportunity here. Everyone else has had one for quite a long time. We get to build ours from scratch. So this is a really big opportunity to kind of acknowledge that small communities have a very different reality. So maybe just the standard cut and paste National Building Code doesn't work in a small community. Like there's places where they want to build log houses. That does not meet National Building Code for the most part with a log house. So for energy efficiency and all these other things. So how do we build an act that is reflective of where we are and nuanced enough to allow people to solve problems uniquely in small communities? Because yeah, if we cut and paste, like a lot of it's going to be kind of technical and regulatory that's going to have from other acts, but really engaging in the weedy bits of that one I think will really be helpful. To give options, so when someone does want to do a house somewhere in a community that's not a market, they can be creative and do something that maybe doesn't tick the box other places. Yeah.
Thank you. So I see that we have no more questions. So I'd like to say thank you for joining us today, and this concludes our public briefing on housing as a human right. Thank you, Mr. Warburton.